Welcome to SageSTEP Shorts. Some of you may be familiar with the SageSTEP project, which is a long-term fuel reduction treatment experiment with 20 sites across the Great Basin. We now have at least 10 years of post-treatment data, and we're putting the results out in a special issue of the journal Ecosphere. Today, I have one of those authors, Dr. Beth Newingham, here to tell us about her recent paper. Welcome, Beth. You have a new paper coming out in the SageSTEP special issue of Ecosphere. Tell me what that is about.
Well, as Lisa mentioned, we have 10 years worth of data now in the SageSTEP project, and previous studies have looked at the 3-year and 6-year responses. So this is one of the first papers to come out talking about plant community responses about a decade after the treatments have been applied. Previous studies have looked at how broad functional groups and species of interest, particularly cheatgrass and say sagebrush, have responded to some of these treatments. We took this a step further this time, and we looked at additional functional groups. So we looked at how forbs would respond to treatments as well as biological soil crust. And then we also broke some of those functional groups down even further to look at species of interest, which included things like blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue.
So what would you say was your most important result?
Okay, so for those of you that aren't as familiar with the experiments at SageSTEP sites, we have 2 different experiments. I'm going to be focusing on the woodland experiment, where we have prescribed fire treatments, as you can see on the top here, as well as mechanical treatments, which was lop and scatter to remove junipers. We have sites that are at 2 different soil temperature and moisture regimes, as you can see on the left, which is warm and dry sites, and then cool and moist sites down below. There is also a gradient of tree encroachment at these sites, so you'll see that represented up top as TDI, which is tree dominance index. And I'm not going to go into the nuances of that because obviously there's a lot to grab out of this graph, but this is a summary showing you some of the functional group responses to those treatments, again, a decade after the treatments were applied. So I think what the most important results here is kind of comparing prescribed fire to mechanical treatments. So if we look at the warm, dry sites, we can see that the prescribed fire has a negative effect on Artemisia or sagebrush shrub, but it has a strong positive response on those perennial graminoids, which confer resilience to these ecosystems. Unfortunately, that comes at the cost of a pretty big increase in annual grasses, which is primarily cheatgrass. The good news is that these negative effects on sagebrush and the annual grasses, or increasing annual grasses, is less so at those cool and moist sites. So comparing the mechanical treatments to the prescribed fire treatments, see that sagebrush actually slightly increases with the mechanical treatments, and we don't have that negative effect that prescribed fire had. We see an increase in those perennial grasses, although it's not quite as strong as it was in the prescribed fire, and we have less of an increase in those annual grasses, although that is still prevalent. And again, we see that there are differences with the soil temperature and moisture regimes where the treatment severity is less with cool and moist sites.
What are you most hoping that managers will take away from your results?
So as you've seen in that chart, there's a lot of details to sort of digest here. And one of the things I really want to make clear is that we need to be careful of thinking that treatments are one size fits all. As we saw that these treatments depend on the functional groups, so different functional groups respond in different ways. And this often depends on tree dominance at the particular site, as well as if it's at a cool moist or a warm dry site. So more than considering those environmental conditions, managers might also think about potential subsequent seeding treatments that they might apply. As always, it's important to think of what post-treatment livestock grazing is going to be, and consider that climate change may affect these community trajectories as well.
So now you've got this study wrapped up. I'm wondering what the next question that you want to tackle with SageSTEP data might be.
Right. So as I said, previous studies have focused on those functional groups, and we have delved more into specific species responses and other functional groups that hadn't been covered in the past. However, we still have a lot more work to do. So we're interested and have started some analyses looking at diversity responses, looking at the relative responses among species and how they might influence influence each other, as well as trying to tease out some of the patterns for some of the less common species, but the important species, including a lot of forbs that are important for sage grouse. Another exciting thing that we're working on is we're developing a species guide to the 10-year treatment responses, which will be geared towards managers. And this will allow managers to look up specific species at those certain site conditions to see how they responded at various sites across the region. And this is the idea. The idea here is that they can use this to decide what treatments are appropriate for a particular species at a particular site.
So the species guide will be available. Watch our social media channels as well as the SageSTEP website. There's a link to Beth's paper that will come up below. And we'll be doing more of these SageSTEP shorts as more papers are available in that special issue.